If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello Internet, welcome back here. I'm excited. Now I know it's boring. I know people say to me I'm boring because I always say that, but I really am. I really love hearing these stories. And the man I'm speaking to today said to me something very truthful. He said to me, this is like a luck card, this is like a puzzle which is coming together. Because it's impossible. There's not one book which we can write which will cover all aspects. It's just not possible. A book will be probably a series of about 1,000 books. No one will read them. But here at Legacy, because you hear a word from the mouth of the people who are there, you can actually judge for yourself and you can say, right, what happened? And there's nothing better in life than a testimony. At the end of the day, you can either reject it or you can accept it. You can't argue about it. Unless you were there, better keep quiet. And for the first time, we have a medical doctor here with us, Dr. Jean du Plessis. And he contacted me, and I'm very glad he did. And I thank you for doing that, doctor. I'm really glad about that. Because we want to know. We want to know what happened to the young doctors when they get out of medical school, and now the Army, or the Navy, or the Air Force, whoever, the SADF, now grabs me. And for the next 2 years, they have to serve as soldiers in the medical services, I suppose. But they do get training as well. They didn't just arrive there as an officer. They do go through basics, I understand. So welcome here, and we're listening. Can you tell us, how did this happen? I mean, did you get your call-up papers at school like everyone else, and then you deferred, you're going to medical school? I hope it was not turkeys. But if it was, it doesn't matter. Now he's shaking his head, thank God we don't like turkeys, Free State University myself. But anyway, probably not. Now he's shaking his head again. I'm keeping quiet. Doctor, it's over to you. Thank you, sir. Very welcome.
Chris, excuse me. Thank you very much, Chris. I really want to say that I appreciate your efforts and inviting participants from all aspects of our military units and input. I see people like myself as small pieces in the jigsaw puzzle, as I said, and it's not just important for me, but I'm sure it's important for everybody because, every small piece actually helps to build that bigger picture and stuff. And, people like me may not be the main focus, but certainly every piece has a place to complete the picture. My 2 years of national service, which was 1988 and 1989, occurred at a time of rapid escalation and changes. And for years, I had questions of what and how things happened. Slowly, pieces fell into place, and there was a lot of searches that I did on YouTube and other forums. And a number of questions were answered through the years, but in particular, Chris, with the legacy conversation, that one when you actually interviewed the tank gunner, that made such a lot of sense for me. And it was almost like a lot of pieces of the puzzle just rapidly started filling a lot of my part of the picture anyways. I commented on that episode, and that led directly to you inviting me, and I was so glad that you did, and I just want to thank you again. Now, my story is to acknowledge every other SAMS member who served in the medical services. I want to pay respect to all of them, and also take a moment to remember those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. Our motto is Audaces Servamus. It's the Latin for we serve the brave. And that's what we did, regardless of where we were all stationed. It is quite the motto, Chris, if you think about it. And it also does not limit your service to your own forces. It takes me back to documentaries on the Falklands where the British medical services had friend and foe next to each other being treated at stages of that war. And it also brings me back to our motto once again and our service, where we certainly were not limited to only servicing our own forces. I want to start my story in school. Like you mentioned, we all got a call up, and it was when we were in standard 9, we had to fill in paperwork, got our numbers. And I went to Krugersdorp. In Krugersdorp, I went to Hoërskool Monument, quite a famous school for sports and rugby. And I was glad I was there because I got so busy with sports and other activities that I studied very little. I was too busy. Now, I was also in the courses in the hostel. Now, of course, that suited me down to a T, because, our study time was between 2 and 3 o'clock. And, I went to play Jukskei just because the Jukskei practice was actually between 2 and 3 o'clock. So I didn't have to study. Now, the problem is you need to study to get into med school. Okay. My parents told me, Jean, you'll have to study more because you will not get accepted into medical school. I just said, yes, we'll see. So at the end of the day, at least I was head boy in 1979. I played first in rugby. We won the Administrators' Cup. So I certainly, from a lot of perspectives, pulled my weight. But studying was not part of the weight that I pulled. And needlessly to say, I was not accepted into medicine. Now, because I wasn't accepted into medicine, I decided still to go to university first, because it became a mission for me to get into medical school. So I did a bit of a scenic route to get to medicine. I had to do a year of BSc, and then thankfully after the first year of BSc, I could actually change over. I was lucky enough to get into medicine school. Anyways, but of course, I'm saying these things because that 1 year that I had to study something else also pushed and guided my life in such a direction that, I would not have had it if I was actually accepted into medicine immediately without my little scenic route. My first experience, anything military, was during our orientation. I went to Stellenbosch, and our first year of medicine is still on the main campus. In our orientation period, that's dooptyd. That was really to gel the people that came from the army and then the guys that came straight from school and stuff. And there was this one, it was a few weeks into orientation when the seniors actually called us all together like they usually did. But this time they said, you are the worst group of first years we've ever had in this courses or hostel. And then they all left. But what we didn't know is they were actually looking through the curtains from outside this hall to see our reaction. Because the first person who got up and said something after a pause, nobody said anything. And the next minute, this one guy stood up, and he was a corporal in the army. He just finished his national service. And he shouted at the top of his voice, the effing problem in this effing place is that there's no effing discipline. And that was quite funny. But anyways, we only found out later that it was all obviously a setup. We were not the worst group of first years anyways. But that was just my first introduction or contact with anything military. And certainly a lot of the other guys had finished their national service as well. The rest of my university went without a hitch. And then we were called up in the January intake in 1988. So my friends and I, most of us, went into the January intake, and we turned up at Klipdrift, because that's in Potchefstroom where all the medics were. We arrived there all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, but hurry up and wait quickly became the mantra, like I'm sure it always happens in the army. We got our kit, we had a haircut, the works, we were given our R5s, not the R4s, we got R5s. Life was good. I was going to get married in October of 1988, long enough after my basic training. And why my wedding is part of this conversation will become evident a little bit later. So we were still with the medics at Klipdrift for the first day or so, just to do paperwork, fill in forms and so forth. Now, I sat there filling in forms, and one of the guys that came from school sat next to me, and he said to me, please fill in my form. And I said, I've finished mine, have my pen and do it yourself. He said, I cannot write. Because that was an eye-opener. I did not think that we had anybody coming to do national service that could not write, whether he was making things up or not. But I don't think that was the time that he would have been making up things at all. I think he could honestly not write. But anyways, so I filled in his form for him. And then, we were separated from the medics, and we went to Wittrand for the rest of our basics. Now, Wittrand was an old psychiatric hospital. It really worked out well as a camp for basic training because it had a bungalow type of setup with different bungalows I think there were about 20 per bungalow. And then it had a good office area for the offices and everything else. So in our bungalow of 20 people or so, we had doctors, dentists, pharmacists, and then we also had the fly spies. Those were the health inspectors, and they were lovingly known as fly spies. Anyways, so apart from cleaning our bungalow, making our beds, and if I say cleaning the bungalow, because I mean clean the bungalow, the typical thing that everybody did in all their basics and stuff, where to scrub, where to polish, where to carry on. Anyways, but we expected that. We did it without any complaints and stuff. So apart from making our beds, having inspections and stuff, our basic training was actually much different from what I expected it would be. We did very little structured physical training. We drilled and drilled and drilled, which was good. But, as I said, we all hoped for doing a little bit more physical training, but we didn't. We had lectures on military structures, the ranks, and the usual stuff. But, of course, I learned how to play bridge, the card game. We kept ourselves busy with playing bridge for hours and hours and hours. We did absolutely nothing medicine related. We had competitions disassembling and assembling our R5s. We got really good at it, even blindfolded and stuff. We had intra-bungalow competitions and stuff, and that was really fun. I think we only went to the shooting range twice, and that was it. And that was also the only time that we were issued with any live ammunition. The rest of the time we had no ammunition, which made a bit of a mockery of standing guard at night with an empty magazine. But, it was potch, not anybody, we didn't expect any problems, but, you stood there with an empty magazine. To an extent, of course, looking at my basic training, I felt sorry for the people who were the officers having to look after these doctors and dentists and everybody else. I don't think they really knew how to manage a bunch of graduates. And I'm saying that with respect. For instance, when we got our yellow fever injections, we milked that vaccination. I think we got, I can't remember how many more days out of not being able to do anything, including drilling, simply because we had the vaccination and all the side effects. You're not allowed to do any strenuous exercise. Not that drilling was strenuous, but we made it strenuous. Anyways, there was an occasion when the other units came to recruit people, for instance, the Rakkies. I wasn't one of them that volunteered to go to one of those type of special forces units. But quite interestingly, it was not that long, maybe a week or so, almost all of those guys that volunteered came back. So it shows you that the eye of the needle is really tiny to be accepted into our special forces. And I think that's always the way that it was, and that was a good thing. One of the few highlights of our basic training was most likely our 2 weeks of bush phase just outside Warmbath. We did map reading, tracking, ambush laying, the stuff that you would do in your bush phase, and that was fun. We really enjoyed it. It was during our bush phase that I earned my skid bulky, and very few of us actually got skid bulkies, course. Cynically, I think that not many of our officers were happy that anybody got a skid bulky, because doctors are not supposed to be able to shoot properly, you know what I'm saying? But anyways, there you go. We did our best. The other highlight during my basic training was when we marched through the streets of Pretoria. I think we got the freedom of the city or something. That was really a special occasion. The low point in my basic training was probably when they called the doctors to tree on in front of the HQ. When we were all in front of the HQ, just the doctors, the married guys were told to go back to their bungalows. So we were approximately 14 doctors left that were unmarried at that stage. And we were told that we will go for training after basic training to participate in an operation that will last a few months. So when I pointed out that I'm getting married in the middle of the planned operation, I was just told to keep my mouth shut. Don't care about your personal life of getting married and stuff. That's your problem. So, the basic training then dragged on a little bit, and I came quite adept with playing bridge once again. As I said, I still remember the way that you call bridge, and I haven't played bridge since then. Anyways, the only medical stuff we were lectured on was in the last week of basics, when we had lectures on the ballistics and the damage caused by the different calibers that we were using in our rifles and the stuff that we were using. And we were explained why we went from the 7.62 millimeters to the 5.56 millimeters. And of course, those lectures and stuff, it is amazing the difference between those two calibers, the damage that they can actually do. Then, for some reason, we got only one handout, which was just 2 A4 pages, and that was on the management of head injuries. Why they chose head injuries as such, I wouldn't have a clue, but that will become evident as well. Now, that played a role in what happened later on. Our basic training then ended with the typical parade, and I remember how there were obviously people with many more ranks coming to see the Klaar out parade from basic training. And I remember how the officers were congratulated on how they managed to get all these graduates drilling so nicely. But we did such a lot of drilling, it almost became second nature. But we were very proud of the fact that our staff and us then were complimented about the way that we drilled. So I went straight from Potchefstroom to Port Elizabeth because I was actually part of EP Command, and went straight there. With having been volunteered for that course, or preparation for the operation, I didn't stay in Port Elizabeth for a long time. I was only there for about a week or two. I moved into the officers' mess, left my stuff in the room, went to meet the officer commanding, and apart from saying welcome, he said to me, "Jean, you've got to go to a box and dining event." So that was really boxing. The young guys were boxing, different units were boxing against each other. And so off I went to this box and dining thing. Now, of course, for some reason, I had to go in my step outs. And of all the things that I had in my bag, I did not have my step out shoes with me. I went to this box and dining with suede shoes. And my function there was basically to examine the guys, take their blood pressure, make sure that they're healthy enough to box, and then if anybody got injured, to manage bleeding noses or whatever. And as luck would have it, the first person that walked into where I was taking blood pressures and stuff was a brigadier of some sort. And of course, I tried to pull my trousers down as low as possible, but he immediately saw my suede shoes. And I just said to him, "Feet problems, sorry, Brigadier." I did not have time because I could not even go to the stores to actually get a second pair of shoes. It was too short a notice. But anyways, he didn't say anything. I think he humored me. But anyways, yeah. Now, during my short stay in Port Elizabeth, I went with their medical team to Grahamstown to actually examine the new recruits for the intake in Grahamstown. That was really nice, of course, because the staff from EP Command, they were just absolutely magnificent. We stayed in a nice hotel. We had an interesting week. One of the guys that I saw, to classify them, he had long hair, he had a beard, and he sat just, across from me, and he said to me, he wants to leave the camp to go and buy a live chicken. Because then I sit there and I think, okay, so why would he want to have a live chicken? Is he not getting fed? I'm pretty sure they're getting fed. So I said to him, "So why do you want to buy a live chicken?" He says to me, "I want to put a spell on that guy." Now, it turned out that that guy was actually the corporal, chasing them and making them go everywhere. And he didn't like being chased around. So he wanted to put a spell on the corporal. And I said, no, you can't leave camp to go and buy a live chicken. And I actually referred him to the psychologist that was there as well. He was declared unfit for national service. He had some other problems as well. So, it's not everybody that turns up for an intake was actually accepted to then continue with their national service. Now, the next phase of my national service was the preparation for the operation. The first 3 weeks was actually purely theoretical, and that was in Voortrekker Hoogte. So I pitched up at Voortrekker Hoogte, and of course, I'll level with you. The minute that I walked into my first lecture, my faith in our military was immediately restored. As I said, and I'm saying that because we didn't have a really structured basic training and stuff, that first lecture, I knew these guys know, and our forces know what they're talking about and what they're doing. The lectures were professional. The officers were extremely knowledgeable, and they came from many disciplines in the army. I don't think we had anybody else. I think it was only basically the 14 volunteers way back from our Wittrand intake. So we got some briefing of what expired in Angola over the last number of months. We were told what specific logistical issues were problematic during those operations and how it will be fixed for this coming operation. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but they were certainly talking about modular, Hooper, and Packer, which I only realized that years later. I can still remember brandstof, olie, smeermiddels. That's basically fuel, oil, lubricants, all those things as they come down the logistics and stuff. And we were taught how to give orders, how to make sure that everything ran smoothly. Now, that was not going to be our main. We were not the spearhead of those things, but they said in this operation, they wanted to make sure that everybody, including the medical support, will know exactly what to do in case of, I can't say an emergency, but certainly some breakdown or whatever. We were even taught how to identify MiGs. You can't really identify them, but we were supposed to say, okay, so that's what a MiG looks like when it flies really high and stuff. We prepared for potential chemical warfare because we had to put on gas masks and everything else. The only worrying feature, even at this stage, was that everything that was drilled into us was in the context of you cannot ask for air support. Okay, so that was a very clear message. Do what you do, but you cannot ask for air support. But we had a great time, and that was 3 weeks in Pretoria for Voortrekker Hoogte. And I think I was quite privileged to have actually gone through that training and stuff. So straight from Voortrekker Hoogte, we went to Luatla. Now, that's where I realized the gravity of what we were actually preparing for, Chris. We joined with the permanent force members, there were citizen force members, there were national service groups. It was just huge, and I've seen some, not about that specific one, but, I think Operation Sweepslag or whatever, they've got names for those things, but there were thousands of troops. There was everything that we were going to be involved in. We had the opportunity to play with those Milan anti-tank missiles. Not that we shot the missiles, because we were taught that they cost, I can't remember how many R1,000 per missile, but it does have a little computer where you can actually, it's a simulator that you can actually follow it. It was great. We played with some other weapons and stuff as well. We were even in the Ratels, we were taught how to draw the lager at night, to make sure that you've got that surround defense and stuff. The one day they actually put us in trenches and fired with the cannons just to make us feel, what it feels like, what it sounds like. Now, one of those rounds fell a little bit close, and a piece of shrapnel fell on the guy right next to me, fell on his face. Of course, that piece of shrapnel was about the size of my little finger, and he had a little burn mark on his face. It was all jagged and stuff. And I remember one of the captains wasn't too happy about what happened there. It was way too close for comfort. Anyways, then, not just going to the trenches, but we were also on the side where they shot the cannons. And that was really interesting. It's quite amazing how those, that feeling when those shots go off. Now, the one mistake that I made when I got a little bit more comfortable looking and listening to all the noise, there was one of those 25-pounders, thankfully. I walked a little bit too far to the front, and as it shot, that back blast caught me from the side, and lesson learned. Don't stand in front of that little plate. You're not supposed to be there. Anyways, now, because in Luatla, in the same training, there were permanent force members who were actually in Angola in those operations and stuff. And they were most likely were going to go back with us for the operation. One guy was specifically talking about the new anti-tank missile, and I think you've had that on Legacy as well, or at least I've seen stuff where they've talked about that anti-missile, the ZT3 or something. We were very impressed just with him talking about it. Now, the commanding officer of Grootfontein Hospital was also at Luatla. When he heard I was marrying a physiotherapist, he asked me whether I would come to Grootfontein because he needed a physiotherapist in the hospital as a matter of urgency, as there were orthopedic patients there in that base hospital. He didn't elaborate, but it turned out there were UNITA soldiers in the Grootfontein base hospital on an ongoing basis. So I said to him, so if I come to Grootfontein, what's the fine print? He said, well, if you come to Grootfontein, you will not go on this operation. He said, you can go and get married. And then what he expected us to do is to actually stay there for at least 12 months, which would have been towards the end of my national service. For me personally, this solved a major problem, Chris, in the sense that I didn't have to postpone my wedding, and I took him up on the offer. As it turned out, we had a week left of our Luatla phase when we were informed that the operation was cancelled because of peace talks. He then asked me what I wanted to do, and I said to him, because he said, now the operation is cancelled, what now? I said, look, I've already given you my undertaking that I would actually come to Grootfontein, so I'm going to stick to that commitment, and I will come to Grootfontein regardless. So I went back to Port Elizabeth, and I actually discussed my undertaking with the commanding officer of EP Command. He supported my decision and said, look, it solves a problem for him as well, because he had to send a doctor from EP Command to the border every 3 months. And I would then be that EP Command representative on the border. So I saved about 3 or 4 of my mates not having to go to the border. And that worked well for them as well. Never got paid for it, never got thanked. My mates, I'm talking about, I'm just joking. They were just happy that they didn't have to go. So off I went to Grootfontein. Now, this was still before I got married. So we landed at Grootfontein in a Plessis. And on the way to the hospital, of course, there were military hardware that I could not believe. And as a matter of fact, I saw that ZT3 standing there. And I thought, my goodness, this is impressive stuff. So even from day one in Grootfontein, it was full on. I appreciate that those years, we didn't know a lot about PTSD. But I have to say, there were 2 female psychologists who were there to debrief the soldiers that were still, demobilizing from those operations and stuff. And it wasn't my place to ask too many questions, but I remember them saying that their patients told horrific stories of mayhem and chaos when they were there and stuff, So yeah, some of the people, so there was another doctor there, she was civilian because her husband was the permanent force dentist in Grootfontein. We were at school together, and she said to me, Jean, because they were there during those operations, and she said, you cannot believe how patriotic one becomes or became in those months during that war in Angola. She said, because they would, every day the Mirages would take off and they would count them. And then one day, one of them didn't return. And I think that's been well documented as well, Chris. Yeah, so moving on, it was only a few weeks before my wedding, and the officer commanding at the Grootfontein Hospital, they changed over, and the new commanding officer was actually at university with me, a couple of years older than me. And he said, John, you can't go back and get married without having a bachelor's party. So I had my bachelor's party in Grootfontein. Now in Grootfontein, the Menassie, or the mess, also doubled up as a restaurant later at night. So we all went there for a nice dinner. You know, they were really nice. I mean, even one of the psychologists jumped out of the box, you know, as part of this bachelor's party. Because, you know, bachelor's parties are bachelor's parties. So what happened was they started feeding me that Struer rum. You know, I'm not sure if you know Struer rum, but that Struer rum 80. You know, I loved it until my bachelor's night. And, you know, I heard them saying, we have to get Jean drunk tonight. And I realized that for my own preservation, I'd better stop drinking and now start playing drunk. So I actually started playing drunk with, because they wanted to carry me to the hospital. And eventually they did. Now, here I am. They are most probably at a much different level of alcohol intake than I was. And I was just praying that they did not drop me. So first things first, they did not drop me. I actually got to the hospital intact. But now they were adamant that I needed to be on a drip, because, you know, they put vitamin B and glucose and all that type of stuff just to pep me up again. Now, the next prayer that I sent up was, please let them get this drip in the first time. I don't want them to, I don't want to be a pincushion for the night. But I kid you not, first time that drip was in. And as soon as the drip was in, they all left. And as soon as they left, I said to the medic, take this thing off. I'm going to sleep in my own bungalow tonight, and off I went. So that was the end of that. Then after my bachelor's, it was very close to before I left to get married. I was reading a book or something one Sunday afternoon. You know, it was quite nice and quiet in the camp, when an orderly or something came and said, the commanding officer wants you in the hospital now. So it was 2 minutes walk to the hospital. So when I got there, there was a severely injured soldier, one of our soldiers, with a major brain injury. He was the driver of a Rinkels, and they were going up in a convoy up north, and somehow his vehicle left the road and it rolled. So he went through the plate glass course. Now, you know, these things are terribly thick. And he was, yeah. I mean, I'm sure it broke as well. You know, somewhere it must have broken, but, you know, we were told he went through the plate glass. So not only was our commanding officer there, but, you know, basically all the doctors that were in the base itself. So our commanding officer spoke to 1 mil and explained to them the situation about this really, really severely injured soldier. And the specialist at 1 mil said, you guys will have to go ahead and operate on him. They'll sort something out. Now, the problem was, it's a Sunday. There's not a lot of traffic, air, or anything else. You know, there's nothing happening. It's not, you can't just call a plane and say, okay, we've got a severely sick person that has to be evacuated to the Republic. So 1 mil in the meantime said they'll arrange something. Now, we didn't know what the something was at that stage. Now, of course, so we gathered in that little theater, and I think some people know that little theater in Grootfontein. Anyways, we decided, okay, we tossed a coin to make a decision who was going to do the anesthetic and who was going to operate on this guy. So the commanding officer left himself available to liaise, because that was the time before mobile phones and stuff. So he actually physically had to go to his office to actually talk to 1 mil and then get back to us and give us updates and stuff. Anyways, and that's where that 2-page handout on brain injuries became very useful. The one that we got the last day of our basic training. Now, of course, any brain injury is normally not managed by guys that have just left university and 1 year of house surgeon. You know, these are highly specialized stuff. And we knew that we were in for a bit of a ride there. And if I say we flicked the coin, it wasn't to minimize the situation. It was really just, you know, it was almost like a democratic flip of the coin. So thankfully, because in that handout, there was nothing about the anesthetic, how to do an anesthetic for a brain injury. But somewhere they pulled out this textbook, An Introduction to Anesthesiology. And that was written by the professor of anesthetics at University of Stellenbosch. So we knew the guy. And we went to the page where it explained what to use for brain injuries. And there was, you know, it was one of those A5 type of size textbooks. And there was this much on the page of what and how to give an anesthetic for that, because it's, you know, it's obviously much more complicated than that. Anyways, at least what we did have the medication that was mentioned there, and we also had the equipment to deal with the brain injury. So I did the anesthetic, and you know, we've got an unconscious patient. So I did the anesthetic very carefully as per the textbook. And I thought, okay, well, he must be asleep now because I've done all the things. And then the two guys that were operating, I read from that handout, point for point for point. Now, of course, I need to explain this a little bit because it's not gory details, but, you know, when you've got a brain injury and your brain swells up or can swell up, so the point, and that's part of the biggest problem that can happen apart from dying. Now, the handout said, point 1, drill the first hole in the temple on the side where the pupil is dilated, because when you've got a little bit of pressure on the side where the bleeding is, there will be normally the pupil will dilate. Now, he did have a dilated pupil on the one side. So they made a cut and there was a little drill and they drilled a hole into his skull. And now point 2 says, if you don't find any blood, drill a hole on the other side. So the guy on the other side made a cut, drilled a hole on that side. And there was no blood. So now, now the next point says, if you have not found blood on the other side, then you need to randomly drill holes until you find the blood. Now, okay, so now we stand there, we think, okay, right, where to next? So our brains all have a lining on the outside of the brain. So when you drill a hole, the first structure that you would see before you see the brain, or at least when you see the brain, there will be a layer called the dura. So the guy that drilled the first hole on the side of the dilated pupil, he said, but hang on, look at my dura, that lining. It looks a bit dark. It almost looks like there's blood underneath. And yes, oh my goodness, yeah, that's right. So he decided to make a little cut into that, into the dura. And sure enough, of course, the blood spurted out and then it went into a trickle. So now at least we knew that we found the site of where the bleeding on his brain was. So now what to do next? Well, there's not much we can do. And the officer commanding said they are actually flying from Ondangwa, a surgeon and an anesthetist. Both were doing a camp in Ondangwa at that stage. So now this whole process sounds like it didn't take that long. It took a while to get even to this stage. So I think about 2.5 to 3 hours after we started this whole process, two people walked into the theater. The one was the professor who wrote the book, the textbook, the head of the anesthetic department at Stellenbosch, and right behind him as the head of the trauma surgery. Of course, you cannot believe it. So I know that the surgeon made a huge hole in that patient's head and then found the bleeding and he stopped it. And the professor of anesthesia, he said to me, so where's this? And there's different pieces of equipment. He said, where's that piece of equipment? I said, we don't have it. He said, so where's that piece of equipment? I said, we don't have it. I said, Prof, all we have is this anesthetic machine that you see here. That's all we have. And of course, what made me feel not vindicated, but I can't say all he did, and I don't want to minimize because I was so thankful. We were so thankful to see both of those specialists. But he used the same medicines, but he just poured it into that patient to put him in a very deep coma, like now an induced coma, not just an anesthetic and stuff. So he survived. We had to do some other stuff because he also had a collapsed lung and he had a fracture of his neck. So all of that was managed and stabilized before he was then flown back to South Africa to 1 mil. After he left, because we turned the page on that handout, and on the second page of the handout, the last dot point was in big fat letters. If you do not find blood, do not under any circumstances make a cut in the dura unless there's a surgeon present. Now, of course, all I can say is the fact that we didn't see that last bullet point most probably helped to save this soldier's life. As I said, it's just one of those things. Yeah. We followed him up. He was in a coma for 2 weeks in 1 mil, and he had a very long rehab. He eventually, if I say eventually, I'm talking about months later, because we did want to know what happened to him. He ended up being able to shave himself, so he could actually perform functions of daily life. He was also the only son of a widowed mum. Seriously, it's one of those sad stories, but at least he survived. That was the important part of that specific incident. So anyways, I got 2 weeks leave to go back to the Republic and get married, go on honeymoon, and then Michelle came back with me. So we stayed in some shared accommodation in the camp for a couple of days or so, and then we got a really nice, one of those, it's a 4-bedroom trailer in Grootfontein itself, and that's where we stayed for the rest of our Grootfontein stay. So Michelle wanted to start work immediately, as did the hospital, but of course, here's the bureaucracy. She did not have security clearance, okay? So she couldn't work. Now, so to get security clearance, she would have to go back to South Africa and then get clearance, and that would have been a process. I can't remember how long it was going to take. But then our commanding officer actually found a loophole. So she got contracted as a civilian. Okay, so then she didn't need a security clearance. Figure that. Anyways, so she rented a little room at the GP's in the town itself. So she saw the permanent force members who needed physiotherapy in the practice at the GPs, and then she did hospital visits for those UNITA patients, for which she was basically coming to Grootfontein for. But anyways, I think she most likely earned more as a contracted civilian versus what she would have earned as a salary working for the military. But anyways, yeah. Now, while we're talking about the UNITA soldiers, because that was sad, they were actually I don't think many people in Grootfontein realized that we actually had UNITA soldiers in the hospital, because they were in one ward, and it was called the Magniseni Saal. So you're not allowed to talk about that ward, because they had their own medic, because they're all Portuguese speaking, and the medic was also the interpreter. Because these guys were broken, seriously broken. The ones that came to Grootfontein all had fractures somewhere, and that's all suffered in contacts. They sometimes took about 5 to 6 days before they would actually reach Grootfontein, because they were not evacuated with helicopters or anything. They were put back on trucks or whatever, not even ambulances in most cases. So they had to wait 5 to 6 days to get definitive treatment for their fractures. So often when they would actually arrive in Grootfontein, they would have wound infections, and they had to be on antibiotics for days to weeks sometimes before we could actually operate on them. So we had an orthopedic surgeon who came from 3 military hospital in Bloemfontein. And he came every 6th week, and he stayed there for a whole week. So he did all the complicated stuff during that week. In the 5 weeks in between, we would do all the more, the less complicated stuff. And then he would be back to do the more complicated stuff again. Some of them had these, what's called external fixators. Not all broken bones get plates. They get this, it's almost like, they call it an external fixator. Now, once they've healed up and you remove the fixators, we would give them something for pain. And if you know ketamine is a drug that we use for anesthetic as well. But ketamine, the advantage is you can actually give ketamine without anesthetizing the patient, because it puts you in a dissociative state. It's almost like you're away with the fairies, and it really helps. It really helps with pain. So it's a good medicine just to give for short term. But of course, what was really interesting, 90% of those guys, as soon as they under that ketamine or during that infusion and stuff, they would start talking. They would jibber up in Portuguese. And I said to the interpreter, what are they saying? Or, at least I remember the one guy, he was holding something, and he was holding nothing, but, pronto, blah, 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 in Portuguese. So the interpreter said to me, no, he's actually now back to the day that he was in the contact where he got injured. Isn't that amazing? So he was taken back and spoke, and, he was calling for help on the radio. So yes, no, that was really interesting. Another problem we had was malaria. Some people took their medicine, some did not take their medicine. We had a number of cases where, it's really, well, we did have a laboratory where you need to see the malaria parasite. So we did have a laboratory, but it became very difficult, not became very difficult. I think they found it difficult to always see the malaria parasites. So, you get a high temperature, you get headaches and stuff. And we had one guy that got really sick with cerebral malaria. And then we decided, look, we're not going to wait until we get a positive result for malaria anyways. And we decided there and then that if a patient comes in with a headache and a fever, we're going to add the malaria medicines until we are 100% sure that it's not malaria. And we had no further cases of cerebral malaria after we decided to do that. Yeah. Now, life was good in Grootfontein. I think some people were sent to Grootfontein as a punishment. I can certainly tell you I was not in Grootfontein for a punishment. I was in Grootfontein and I enjoyed literally every moment there. Continued to do some surgery, ran the outpatient clinics for military staff. And, you met really, really nice people. That was such a cohesive group up in Grootfontein. Now, we quickly figured out was when the infantry were going to get an oppie, when they were chased around and really had a terrible, well, not a terrible, but a really intense physical, training and stuff. Because you turn up at the hospital and they will literally sit in the corridor outside the hospital, all waiting to see the doctors. And they were just too many on those days when they were going to get an oppie. They were too many to see. So, and it's almost all like, I've got the flu and stuff, I can't do the oppie type of thing, We ended up just giving certificates and say, go to the pharmacist and actually ask for some flu medicine, because it was physically impossible to see all of them. But it didn't happen too often. But, that was just one of those things. Yeah. One of the patients who made an appointment to see me, I specifically remember it was a major from one of the infantry divisions there. So the whole thing went like this. He walked in, I said, morning, Major. He said, morning, doctor. He said, I think I'm drinking too much coffee. As a matter of fact, I'm sure I'm drinking too much coffee. Well, doc, you know what? I'm going to stop drinking coffee, and if I have any further problems, I'll come and see you again. I didn't have to say a word, and off he went, and he never made an appointment again. So it was, it was just one of those moments where, okay, yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Anyways, when I initially arrived at Grootfontein and I took over from a doctor that'd been there for, I think, 6 months or something, he said to me, Jean, you will most likely see some of the SWAT, the territory force people who come to see you and say that they've been bewitched. Now, of course, if I get criticized for what I'm going to tell you now, that's okay. But I'm going to, as a caveat, say I would rather do this, what I'm going to tell you now, than these people taking some concoctions that they get from some witch doctor or whatever, and then come to harm. So what he said to me, do this. So not long after he left, first patient, I kid you not, doc, I've been bewitched, just like this, serious. I said, okay, what's the problem? He said, oh, my mother-in-law is a witch doctor, and my wife, I fooled around with somebody else, and now my mother-in-law has actually put a spell on me. Now, what I was explained to do, so, I said, okay, so you make up 2 vials. One has peroxide in it, and one has water in it. And then what you do is, of course, you take blood, the patient's blood, and you put the blood in peroxide. And when you put blood in peroxide, it foams and makes this pink foam coming out. So then what happens is they immediately see this reaction, and you say, yes, I can see that your blood is dirty. This is not good at all. Then you give them a vitamin B injection, which is an innocent type of thing. And you say, just go and sit outside for half an hour or so, and we'll test your blood again afterwards. Then they come back, you take their blood once again in front of them, you put it in the water, and nothing happens. So you cap those 2 vials, and you say, you are cured now. Do you know, Chris, that guy came back a couple of days later with a big smile on his face. He brought me a little wooden carving to say thank you. I don't think it happened. I think that was the only one ever. But, he was happy. He was cured. He didn't have to take any concoction, or wasn't tempted to take any concoction and stuff, and he was fine. And I still have a little wooden carving to this day. Yeah. So the health inspector in Grootfontein, he was a friend of mine because we were in the same bungalow. So he did a lot of traveling to different bases because every base didn't need their own health inspector. So I went to one of the Bushman camps for a few days because the doctor of the camp had to go to Windhoek for some case or something. And our commanding officer asked me to cover him in his absence. So we got to the camp, which had a small sarvi. The sarvi is those small, it's basically like a small coal, like a small pick and pay, but it was the military type of place where you could buy food and other stuff, but it was really small. Anyways, so we dropped our stuff in our bungalow, and the 2 of us went to the sarvi. Of course, the next minute, he says to the troop behind the counter, he says, how many soldiers are actually in the camp? He said, oh, Lieutenant, maybe 20. He goes to the fridge, course. He writes off enough meat and other stuff. He said, I'm writing this off. The troop says to him, but Lieutenant, there's nothing wrong with that stuff. He says, just keep quiet, I'm writing it off. We had the best braai that night from the stuff that he wrote off, because he can, that's just what he did. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So on another occasion, my commanding officer said to me, Jean, do you like fishing? I said, oh my goodness, I love fishing. He said, because, Jean, I hate fishing. So some infantry people were on a fishing trip up the west coast. So I said, well, I'm happy to go. So off I went. So I went fishing for a weekend, but we got into Dakota. So we took off from Grootfontein. I think it was mile 108 or one of those places, really far north. Of course, the funny thing about that little Dakota trip was as soon as we got to altitude, one of the pilots came back and said, okay, so, because we're only 4 or 5 people there, because they've already been fishing. I was just there to go and do some medical cover. Anyways, he said, now, if you get seasick or, motion sickness, there's the bags. Make sure you use the bags. The only person who had to use a bag on that trip was the pilot. So it was so funny. So anyway, so we got there, and it was a great weekend again, so yeah. Now, of course, there's a picture there's one of the pictures that I'll send you. There's a guy in a wheelchair. He was a casualty of war. He's one of the territory forces soldiers who was wheelchair bound. Now, he couldn't go home because I think for whatever reason, he needed rehabilitation. So he became part of the furniture in Grootfontein. But I'm just putting a picture there because I think, as I said, lots of people got injured to a more or lesser extent. Yeah, some other photos would be there's another photo of the Grootfontein hospital. It's just from the side. And then there's another one, it's just this obscure little building, but that was our water hole, where it was right next to the hospital. So we would go there for maybe just a beer or two after work. Yeah. But there's another interesting thing is we actually had a SWAPO prisoner that came to our hospital once. He was, we don't ask questions, but anyways, he was transferred to us because he was unwell. We actually had 2 lockup beds in the hospital. The only time that we had to use it was for this SWAPO prisoner. And he had some investigations done. We were waiting for results. And you can imagine, we had to wait maybe a few days and stuff. Well, the interesting thing about this prisoner was that he spoke Afrikaans like you and me. It was amazing. Anyways, but he was nice. We were nice to him. And then he was only there for a few days. And one evening I was actually on call when the medic called me and said, this guy died, just like this. So look, he was quite emaciated. He was quite thin. We never got any results. I suspect that he most likely died of either TB or maybe even age, which was not that much of an issue at that stage. But that's just in hindsight and the reflection and stuff. Why would this guy just drop dead, basically? But there was certainly absolutely. There was no physical violence toward that guy and stuff. He was apart from being emaciated and stuff, he was healthy. And, he was fed properly, but he died in the middle of the night, and there was no foul play there. Because you'll know about the MiG that landed in the field when he got lost. So that MiG that landed on somebody's farm, that MiG was transported to Grootfontein. And it was actually then one of our hangars for a while. So I remember one Wednesday afternoon with sports parade. We normally with sports parade, we would go home and just sleep or whatever. So this one Wednesday afternoon, the MiG was still in the hangar. Michelle and I were sleeping. And the next minute, of course, there was just these, what really sounded like explosions and this rolling. So I jumped up. I said to Michelle, the MiGs are attacking Grootfontein. It's funny what goes on in your head at that stage. And I looked towards the camp, and I couldn't see the camp because it was too far away. And I phoned one of my friends, and I said, because he lived much closer to the camp, and I said, what's happening? Are they attacking Grootfontein? He just burst out laughing. He said, John, no, that was just thunder. But, it wasn't like a thunderstorm or anything. It was just that one, but it was just one of those. And as I woke up, the first thing in my mind is we were getting attacked. Yeah. Anyways, Chris, then UNTAG arrived. We were informed that we would actually share the hospital with a Swiss contingent, and they were tasked to provide the medical support for UNTAG. So the first guys to arrive, even before the Swiss, were the Aussies. So the Aussies, for some reason, they inspected buildings and they got up some roofs and stuff. But Namibia, southwest, north, it's hot. They took their shirts off. We say, listen, get out of the sun. You're going to be burned. Now, we're from Australia. We'll be okay. Next day, 4 of them in hospital with sunstroke. Lesson learned. They didn't, number one, they didn't go up the roof and like that really hot, because everybody takes a siesta. You know what I'm saying? There's that lull when it's really hot and sunny and stuff. But anyways, lesson learned. So the next guys to arrive, I specifically remember the Finnish contingent. They had some special deal with their government, course, because they bought the most expensive cars. There were Volvos, there were you name it. And those poor cars, I don't know where they bought it from, but it was actually there. It stood in that sun. It was full of dust, but they had their great cars as part of their arrangement with their government. Anyways, so one day we're in the hospital as usual, and a few guys, Finnish guys, they run into hospital, they carry one of their mates, and all they get out, because they can't speak English properly, so they say, heart attack, heart attack. So anyways, we take the guy to our small emergency area, and now we're trying to figure out what's going on. Now this guy, he sits there, he's not saying like, like just stroking there, and what's going on. Anyways, now, because of all this commotion, our dentist, he came as well. So we were standing there trying to get a proper history to see, is this now a heart attack or what's going on? And the next minute, he just, the dentist said, hang on. And he actually motioned the guy just to lay down. So as soon as the guy laid down, he put his fingers in this guy's mouth and he did something, and we just heard this click. So this guy had a dislocated jaw, course. So as soon as his jaw was back, he started gibbering back in Finnish and stuff. Thank God, he was all. So what happened to him is, because it was so hot, he fainted wherever they were. And as he fell, he dislocated his jaw. And that's why his mates thought, because now he's got a pain in his neck, it's a heart attack. But anyways, all's well that ends well. So once the Swiss guys came, we became quite friendly with them. We had regular parties. Their Surgeon General, of all people, funny enough, their Surgeon General was there. He played the accordion. We had great times. No, not every week, but we had a few really nice get-togethers. And there's a photo included where it's our commanding officer and their surgeon, and I think one of the anesthetists, and then some of our staff that were sitting at the table. And one you can see is still in his UNTAG uniform. Yeah, they didn't have much to do, Chris, because the guys were usually young, fit, healthy people. They didn't, although they had surgeons and anesthetists, they didn't have to do much. So the anesthetist actually started helping the GPs in the town when they did their cesarean sections and minor procedures and stuff. And she was female. And I remember her saying to me once, she said, John, I cannot believe how quick these guys are. She said, I was still looking to, is this patient asleep? And the guy said to me, you can wake up the patient now. Thank you so much. So it was a good learning curve for them as well, because not only did the GPs do the cesarean sections, but they did it so quick that they had to keep up with the GPs. But anyways, at one of these parties, it wasn't just officers. At one of these specific parties, there was somehow some of the soldiers, the troops started arm wrestling, but not in an aggressive way. There was somehow people started arm wrestling. Now, so it became a competition between them and us. So one of the Aussie guys, he was really good, and you could see that he was good. And he actually said that he is the Western Australian arm wrestling champion. And I think he spoke the truth, because the way that he arm wrestled, you could see he knew what he was doing. But then on our side, there was one of the orderlies. Now, I can remember his name, but I'm not going to say his name, because he was... he was an orderly, but somehow he arm wrestled really well. And he eventually got to the finals with this Aussie guy. And he beat this Aussie guy. So the Aussie guy said to him, how long have you been arm wrestling? He said, it's my first day. That Aussie guy was so impressed. I remember he gave him a lot of money. I just vaguely remember 400 Rand. Now, 400 Rand those days were a lot of money. And I actually saw this orderly when I went back to Uitenhage. He was working as a checkout operator at one of the OK bazaars or something. But that was amazing. But, just the graciousness of that guy saying, listen, it's not often that people beat me, but you beat me, and there's your money. That was here. We also broke the sports embargo, because there were some rugby games between the UNTAG, especially the Aussies, and then our own forces and stuff. Yeah, they were a bit rough, those games. I'm not talking about the Aussies. It was like the guys wanted to show their muscles on both sides. But anyways, And then more towards the end of my stay in Grootfontein, I was on call one morning, called in about 5 o'clock in the morning, and they said to one of our soldiers was actually shot. So what happened was, there was nothing much happening. So these guys went on AWOL. So as they returned from there, wherever they went, I don't know where you go in Grootfontein apart from there's a pub there. But anyways, so as they came back, as they crawled under the fence, the sentry saw them and he ordered the guys to stop. So they ran away and he did shoot one of them. So he shot the guy in his backside, but the bullet went straight through and actually came out in his groin. Now, of course, the anatomy is such that the groin is quite an important junction where the major artery that supplies your leg, plus the vein is the blood vessel that actually returns the blood from the leg, and the nerve, they sit right next to each other. And, I was talking about ballistics before. I could see what that 5.56 millimeter did, because there was this tiny little hole in his backside, but in his groin was just, dare I say, mush. Now, the problem is if you lose either one of those blood vessels, I mean, I'm not even talking about the vein, because then you're not going to be able to move your leg. But if you lose one of those blood vessels, you can bleed to death. Now, he wasn't bleeding that much at that stage, but once again, of course, we phoned 1 mil and said, this is what we have, because I couldn't feel the pulse in his foot, which actually suggested that there was little to no blood flow. It was a little bit pale as well. So 1 mil once again said to us, do what you can. And do what you can. They said, even if you take a catheter, now the catheter is the one that we put in the bladders, to drain urine or whatever. They said, even if you take a catheter and cut it and actually connect the blood vessels. Now, of course, these are highly technical surgical stuff. Okay. And I just thought, oh my goodness, I'm not looking forward to this. Anyways, as I walked back from my office, because that's where I phoned from, I had to walk past the entrance of the hospital. And as I walked past the entrance, the Swiss surgeon was just walking past, because by then it was about 6 o'clock. And I called him over. I said, gee, do you know what? I've got a guy that was shot. And he said, do you want me to help you? I said, please. And I said, let's go. So anyways, to make a long story short, I assisted him and he did the operation. Now, of course, this soldier was so lucky, because in all that mush, once the surgeon actually removed all the mangled tissue and stuff, the artery, the nerve, and the vein sat right next to each other. And the only reason why he didn't have a pulse at the stage that I examined him, because that the main artery went into a bit of a spasm because of that shock wave that came through. So he did not need any major surgery at all. He basically just removed some of the dead tissue and stitched him up, and he was fine. That was really lucky, but I'm so glad that there was a surgeon there, because that was certainly outside of my scope of practice to go and dabble in putting catheters to connect blood vessels and stuff. Because I think that's about most of the noteworthy incidents. We became part of the Merlin forces during that whole time. I completed my 12 months in Grootfontein. And then Michelle and I returned to Uitenhage, because we both had an appointment in the public hospital or the state hospital. And that, it was basically our appointment was interrupted just by my national service. So when I went back to EP command, I said to the commandant, I said, I'm back. He said, well, welcome back, but I've got nowhere to put you, because, the vacancy for sending people to the border, that doesn't exist anymore. So I've got nowhere to put you, Jean. What now? I said, well, I'm happy to go back to Uitenhage Hospital and work there until I clear out. So I actually went back to Uitenhage for the last 2 or 3 months of my national service, because they couldn't accommodate me in EP command. Anyways, Chris, so yes, cleared out, and not much, within a few months after clearing out, Michelle and I actually moved to Pretoria. I attained the rank of captain over there, and I did one camp, and the camp that I did was actually in 1 mil. That was sitting in the emergency department and stuff, which was quite nice. And then, as you know, everything came to an end and we didn't have to do any more camps. But only recently, in the last few months, I was able to, and I think it's via one of those Facebook military, we were Browns or one of those, I actually made contact with one of those medics that was there during my time at Grootfontein. Now, the nice thing was that most of them stayed there for quite a while, at least in 6 to 9 months. They were absolutely fantastic. And I would really like to make contact with more of them because I would love to know what happened to all of them. But anyways, Chris, that's my story. And I really want to thank you very much for this opportunity.
Well, I have to say to you, John, I was sitting here making notes and I was really enjoying this. Thank you. This opened an entirely new piece of a puzzle, as you say to me. And I made notes. I want to know, in 1988, I became a sergeant in the police. I was one of the youngest ever. And of course, a few of my mates became sergeants as well. They were a bit older than me. And of course, we greeted each other very formally. Sergeant, how are you today? I'm fine, Sergeant. And how are you? Blah, blah, blah. Is it the same thing with doctors? When you become a doctor, would you greet your mate like that in a jocular fashion, of course?
Of course, in the military, it was a little bit more formal. I would not call, even though my officer commanding was only 2 years ahead of me, I would not call him by his first name. I know that we did socialize with him, but when we would socialize, I would call him by his first name. But in hospital, I would call him Major. I wouldn't call him by his name. It was quite formal in the military, and I think that was rightly so because I think it was important to really keep that structure.
Yes, it's a military after all. But what
Yes.
were you called during your basic training? Would these instructors just call you like a roof or something with more respect?
Yeah, we were called candidate officers. Sorry, I just remember one more incident. As soon as I arrived at Grootfontein, there was some of the Oman medics. And I remember that we actually had 5 or 6 new arrivals of the UNITA soldiers. And it was about 6 or 7 at night. And the one guy, he said, no, he's not going to, he doesn't feel like helping now. And I said, this is not about feel like helping. I said, if these were your mates, you would have been there in a flash, and I expect you to be there. He didn't say a word, but at least he did help. But I wasn't going to let him say to me, oh, he's an old man, he's not going to pull his weight. Sorry, Chris, yes.
Whenever you go to the army or the police, there's a doctor standing there and he grabs you between the legs with his bloody ice cold hands and tell you to cough. Well, what's that about?
That's quite funny. Now, just before I answer that question, because I had a patient who always said to me, doctors are taught at university to put their fingers on the most tender spot and say, is it sore there? Anyways, no, the coughing business, when you feel down there, there's a certain, there's almost like a varicose vein that can actually run down into your scrotum. And that's what we feel for, because when you cough, the blood impulse goes through that varicose vein by, just to put it in layman's terms, and that's why. So there's nothing, there's nothing sinister about that.
No, okay, because I've heard that many of the homosexual guys actually went to a medical corps. And I don't care whether they went or not, I couldn't care less, but I was wondering about this, guy grabbing you here and you have to cough. But then he doesn't explain why either. He just, grab and get on. Many of us standing.
Yeah, no, it's a specific maneuver, of course, but if you return up, if you turn up repetitively to have it done, then I would ask questions.
I must tell you a story which happened at the police college. They were, of course, the national service doctors were there at the police college. Wonderful, wonderful people, I must say. Very kind people. They were not like the instructors. Because, the police college was totally like basics. And we had, that particular day, we had this most dreadful bunch of injections. I still don't know what they injected us with. And you would do push-ups afterwards, and then your bloody arm is swollen and sore and kind of not nice. But as we were standing in a row, there was this, we thought she was very elderly. She must have been in the late 30s, 40s, early 40s nurse standing there, and she was, you would walk past and she would just jab you. So there's one Englishman behind me, I'm not going to mention his name, God knows, he's probably still alive. He suddenly passes out. before we get to the nurse. And he's never passed out before. So it's a bit of a consternation. And later the doctor comes and look at him and, how you feeling, but all I things. And after a while, he just looked at him, give him a bit of a kick in the ribs, and he walks away. And he says, no, this guy's putting it on. He's putting it on. So, of course, I put the water on him, all the treatment. But he's lying there. He's mad down. He's not moving. He's lying on his stomach. He's not moving. And after another bit of consternation, we got him up and sort of, the verpleegster mood, and she just injected him while he's lying there. And we carried him sort of away. And he opened his eyes. His eyes was like closed like this. He says to me, Koos, is ons weg daar so. I say, yeah, what happened? He said, I found this one nurse a bit attractive, and there was a reaction down below, and he didn't want them to see us, and so he just went to go down, and there he stayed. He said he was thinking of his mother, he was thinking of his grandmother, he was thinking of everything. Yeah, well, he suffered a bit, finding this woman was at least 20 years on him, that attractive, of course, no, but that happened. But there's also responsibility on your people. Do you feel that your training as a doctor was actually sufficient for you to go out and work with human beings?
Of course, if I look and if I can actually compare it to where I'm at the moment, I think we are so fortunate in South Africa now. I'm not going to pretend that once you leave university, you've done 1 year of house surgeon or huisdokter, that you know everything. It takes a good number of years to actually become a specialist. But I think from a trauma point of view, I'm not talking about the brain injury, that was way above any other trauma, but we were very good at managing trauma even at a very early stage, because we started going to Tygerberg Hospital in our second year, voluntary, to the emergency department, where we learned how to stitch people up and everything else. So we were very well trained for what we had to do. Yes, as I said, the brain injury and was certainly, I think, the only time in my life that I would say I did something that I wasn't trained for properly yet.
Do you have a right of refusal if you feel you can't do this, but if you don't do anything, the man's going to die? How does that clash with your oath? Because
I think, seriously, I think at that stage, your oath is actually to do what you can. And, it's not just your oath, it's also the reasonable man test. Part of our oath is to say that we will help every patient up to the natural end of their life. So, I can't make a decision about when the natural end of anybody's life is, but, you do get to a stage where you just have to call it quits. But we didn't have to call it quits on that soldier. He did well, and he was stable enough. It was quite sobering, when we qualified and we got our results that we passed, we went back to the faculty, and there were all the professors standing around. And there were two specific things that I will never forget that they told us. The one professor said, they all said congratulations, but the one said, just remember that you, even though you're all doctors now, you are just in the same bell curve of society compared to anybody else. And 30 years from now on, a number of you will be alcoholics, drug addicted. Some would have, so that's the one thing I remember. Yes, we're just a part of the bell curve of society. And the second thing is, it was our professor of forensic medicine. He said, the fact that you qualified at this university does not mean that your patients will not die. They will also die. Just make sure that your personal cemetery doesn't grow too large. And it was a nice way of saying, don't stuff up. You know what I'm saying? So that was, quite interesting.
Would that bother you? Would it bother you if a patient of yours should pass?
No, because I think when I go to sleep at night, when I go to sleep and I know that I've done everything, I can't say humanly possible, medically possible for a patient, according to all things that I've been taught, and the patient dies, I can accept that. Then I don't have any problem and stuff. And that's where, you know, just make sure that your person's cemetery. And I think, you know, because I can honestly say, you know, there's sometimes a little angel on your shoulder and stuff that helps you with certain cases. You know, I'm now a neonatal specialist. It means that I only work with sick newborn babies, and they die as well, although they're very resilient. But why I'm saying this to you is because even if a baby does not make it, because there are only so many things we can do, I can accept that. What I cannot do, and that's why I can't work with kids who suffer from cancer. I cannot do that. So if you say to me, you know, does it bother me? I'm in a job where I can accept when patients die, but there are other jobs that I cannot do because I will not be able to handle it.
Is it a logical choice for you to specialize in something? I mean, many doctors stay on being a GP, loves that type of thing. Is there something which clicks in your head during your studies? Or perhaps a professor who influenced you?
No, what happened to me was I was actually a GP for 13 years. And then one day in GP practice, I sat there and thought, I don't want to become old Dr. du Plessis in this practice. No, I'm just teasing. No, I got really bored. I got exceptionally bored. And then I thought I need to specialize in something. And that's what I specialize. So if you say there's something that clicks in your head, I think it does. Mine just clicked in much later than other people.
No, that's great to hear. I know that the army people were taught about the Geneva Convention during their training. Funny enough, the police, we were never taught that. So we never fell under the Geneva Convention either. So we could actually use expanding bullets, things like that, quite legally. Even though I think in the spirit of the law, probably not that legally, but it's a different setup. And you did mention here that the medical service is absolutely open for the enemy soldiers as well. Did you ever hear of anything where people refuse to treat the enemy combatants ever?
Of course, I have not. You know, because the reality is once, the way that I see it, and I think the way that, dare I say, other doctors will see it as well, I think once you've got a patient, a combatant is one thing, a patient is something different. A combatant becomes a patient as soon as they get injured. And I think once, you know, that's the great leveler, is the patient.
And they're all human beings. I mean, a terrorist has the same body as
Yes.
one of your own.
Yes. And I certainly read somewhere, you know, because I've seen the evidence and stuff, and I've certainly seen those programs about where it bothered some of our soldiers as well to actually find Bibles in the trenches. You know what I'm saying? Because it's not just that was there for propaganda purposes, you know. Yeah, so I think from that perspective, no, as I said, was absolutely, you know, patient is a patient, regardless of their color or whether they your friend or foe.
We were very proud of our medical services. I must tell you, I think we had in the history of warfare a fantastic capabilities with a medical service. We knew that our medics, our combat medics, ops medics could keep people alive. And if we could only then get that soldier back to the real doctors, they would certainly save him. Which comes back to the responsibility. Now, there's also stories on the other hand. Some people wrote books who were medics and said they abused the medical kit for drug use, things like that. Was that widespread? What do you know about such things?
Because I don't think it was widespread. I'm not saying it was never going to happen, because, you know, as I said, at the end of the day, I'm back to that bell curve of society. People get either carried away or they've got their own demons that they have to deal with. You know, I know of some of my mates, not specifically in the army, but, you know, there was people who committed suicide. Yeah, so and that's directly, a lot of them are directly related to drug use. So, you know, if you, and I think there's statistics about the specialties that have the highest incidence of committing suicide, and I think anesthetist is actually one of them. Now, I'm not sure whether it's because of the high stress job that they do, or whether it's because they just have access and there's that little, you know, it's a personality type that would actually then start using drugs. But I can honestly tell you, it was not widespread, because there was, apart from it not being widespread, those medical bags and stuff were sealed, and you had to account for the medicines in there. You couldn't just grab a bag and come back and say, oops, there's no ketamine, it fell out of the bag, or there's no morphine or pethidine and stuff, it accidentally broke. No, those things didn't wash. So it would, if it did happen, it would have been, you know, sporadic incidences, I would say.
I always ask you people here at the end of a conversations, it's not an interview, it's a conversation. If there's some young lad or less listening here and he or she wants to become a medical doctor, do you think that it's a good idea or a bad idea? What advice would you give to them?
Because like anything that you do in life, dare I say, it should be a calling. I mean, for me personally, I always wanted to become a doctor since I could remember. Now, I don't want to over or underemphasize this, but if you want to become a doctor, you know, doctors are not more intelligent than the rest of the population. I mean, there are certainly much more clever people than myself and other people in my profession. But, you know, at the end of the day, if you are willing to sacrifice time to study, and you know that you're going to work night shifts, you know you're going to be sometimes in a perpetual state of jet lag, those things often happen, and people can choose specialties where they don't work at night. But I will absolutely choose exactly the same if I had my life over. And I can certainly, if people want to study medicine, I can only just encourage them. The only thing that I have a bone to pick with is the absolute difficulty in which people have to get into medical school. The problem with the way that people are shortlisted, it's whether it's in South Africa or whether it's even here in Australia and stuff, you know, it doesn't always mean that you get the best people to become doctors. You know, I think, you know, just because you're clever, as a matter of fact, some people go study medicine because their parents told them to go and study medicine. If your parents tell you to study medicine and you don't want to become a doctor, stay away. It's you know, your parents are going to pass away one day and you're going to be unhappy because you're going to be doing something that you do not want to do. I think everybody should just make a decision and become what they know or hope that they would enjoy.
My wife has asked me to ask you this question. As a medical doctor, how important is it for people to live right? Get the exercise, get the sunlight on the skin without burning, eat the right foods, you know, or just run to the doctor and get a pill?
Of course, we're now talking about evidence and stuff, and I'm talking about whether it doesn't matter what you do, but the more stressful your work is, the more you need to exercise and stuff, because you do actually get hormones released that will help you with your stress. You need to eat healthy, because otherwise you just go into a vicious cycle. Now, genetics play a huge role in all of this, and you can't move away from your genes. But, you know, forget about genes, whether you've got good, bad, or indifferent genes. If I say bad genes, you know, where heart attacks run in families and stuff, regardless of your genetic background, you have to, if I say have to, this is not a lecture. It is just, you know, I do exercise because I need to exercise. It's not to de-stress myself, but it does make me more resilient to the hours that I need to work. And I do try to eat healthy. I'm not a health freak at all, but I do try to eat healthy because all of those little bits and pieces do count.
I'm really glad you say that, because some of our veterans are really overweight. and they drink and they smoke and they dine. We've lost now, I lost count how many people we were supposed to interview, have conversations here at Legacy, and unfortunately we were called up for higher services before I could get to them. So if there's any veterans listening here, and all of you are, thank you for that. I think it's a good thing to say, just keep in shape, man. If it's possible, just look after your body, and your body will look after you.
Of course, absolutely. And I'm not talking about becoming an Arnold Schwarzenegger or anything. You know, even if you just go for a 20 to 30-minute walk every second day or something, because, you know, if you are overweight, you know, it's a vicious cycle as well. You don't want to walk because you get sore knees and everything else. I myself went through a phase about, dare I say, about 8-9 years ago now, where I didn't exercise. I started getting aches and pains and stuff. And I, for various reasons, had a sore shoulder. I went to the orthopedic specialist. He said, you need a shoulder replacement. And I said, no. He said, it's not if, it's when. I said, I'm going to the gym and I will come and see you if I ever get to that stage. Now, of course, now my shoulder doesn't have any cartilage, but it's not sore anymore because I slowly started exercising and stuff, and I slowly built it up. Now, I can't just say this is the only example, but anything is better than nothing. And as I said, even walking and stuff, you know, whether you walk on a treadmill, and then watch what you eat, because, you know, it's calories in, calories out. If you eat more calories than you expend, and the problem is the more you eat, the slower your metabolism becomes. And, you know, exercise will help speed up your metabolism, and it doesn't matter what your body type is, it will work.